We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. An assassination attempt against Donald Trump over the weekend has changed the political equation in the United States. We're heading towards November at a time when the U.S. empire is in decline and when the capitalist system is in crisis. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author, he's a political organizer, and he is the co-host of the Freedom Side Live, a live video show every Thursday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Breakthrough News. Eugene, welcome back.
Brian, thank you so much for having me again.
Well, in an instant, the political situation shifted once again inside the United States with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Already, Joe Biden, insulated from reality, apparently, by a close and smaller group of advisors, is insisting that only he can beat Donald Trump. Well, quite clearly, Donald Trump was winning before the assassination attempt. Now it seems to be even more conclusive that Donald Trump is definitely the front runner. The RNC is underway. There's some interesting politics there that I want to talk to you about. But let's just talk about the politics of assassination. You know, on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy, the president of the United States at that time, was murdered in Dallas, Texas. 5 years later, his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was also assassinated right after he won the California primary. He was on his way to become the Democratic Party nominee. He would have very likely beaten Richard Nixon. He was promising to end the war in Vietnam, but he was dead. He was assassinated in June 1968. Of course, that came just 2 months after the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We have other political assassinations in the United States. Of course, the killing of Abraham Lincoln 4 days after the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee's army, surrendered at Appomattox. That, too, had a profound impact. Anyway, there has been periods of extreme political instability, and they become hallmarked by political assassinations. In that context, let's just talk about what the attempted assassination of Trump might mean for politics going forward, or in fact already does mean.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, of course, we'll always have to see what takes place. But I mean, it certainly does seem that at least the attempt on his life and his response to it, the fist being up, the yelling for fighting, different things like that, the photos that have come out do seem to help Trump emphasize some of the themes that he wants to emphasize vis-a-vis President Biden, primarily the issue of Biden's age, the issue of Biden's mental infirmity, at least the alleged mental infirmity. But I think, we're all looking at what's happening. He's obviously slowing down quite a bit, where Trump, of course, looked vigorous in all of these different pieces. And even though he's being heavily critiqued by some Democrats, he was out playing golf, this, that, and the third. I think the overall sort of image that he's trying to present, that he's more vigorous, he's more out there, he's more with it, so on and so forth, are all bolstered by his response to the attempted assassination. How people perceive it, of course, we'll have to see. But I do also think that it's opened up a challenge for the Democrats, whose only real, response to Trump was that he's the next Hitler, democracy will be over. I mean, that was their entire theme. But of course, now they've taken their foot off the gas. I mean, Biden has pulled down his ads for some unknown amount of time. Perhaps by the time, this show airs, they'll be back up. But certainly Biden is emphasizing, and in the context of what he himself was emphasizing and everyone was emphasizing around the need to take down the political temperature inside of the United States. Well, that essentially means, vis-a-vis what the Republicans are saying, that Biden's own statements, he's the next Hitler type of stuff, was behind the assassination, that the Democrats will not actually be leaning on what at least they perceived to be their strongest sort of campaigning option, which also gives Donald Trump an opportunity to mainstream himself a little bit more. I mean, of course, he was trying to contrast himself with Biden in terms of his physical issues and mental issues, but also in terms of now being able to break out of the box of being, the next Hitler, anti-democratic, all these other things that Trump was obviously struggling to say that that was not who he was, the issue of being against a national abortion ban and so on and so forth. But now this gives him an even bigger chance to do that because the Democrats won't be able to present him, or at least probably will not present him, in the same light, which means he'll be able to speak to those who may have been concerned about the critique that the Democrats are making of him, that he is unusually anti-democratic, that the U.S. political system will collapse under him, that perhaps a form of fascism will rise under Trump. And of course, whatever one thinks about Trump, whether you love him or whether you hate him, if you have that type of fear that is not being heavily promoted around him, it obviously makes it easier for him to win. So I think on a range of different fronts, the attempted assassination does make it easier for Donald Trump to emphasize the things he'd already been emphasizing, but in a way that is easier for him because the Democrats won't be presenting as much of an opposition to his attempts to emphasize these various themes.
One of the things that jumps out during every election cycle, Eugene, is how the Democrats present the Republicans as basically the end of the world. I can remember even parts of the left supporting Mondale in 1984 because they said if Reagan is reelected, it's the end of democracy. The Democrats have been making the same sort of assertion. And parts of the left who rightfully fear fascism because fascism is an organic element in capitalist politics, especially capitalism in crisis, capitalism in decline. They think, well, yeah, fascism. But, this is a false narrative. I think it's a truly false narrative and one that the left should resist. When you look at Biden's policies, when you look at the Democratic Party's policies, and you look at what Trump stands for and what the Republicans stand for, they have much more in common than what separates them. They both support the military-industrial complex. They're both servants of Wall Street. They're both unanimously almost support every increasing military budget that gets introduced in Congress. Both parties actually add to the budget request from the Pentagon. The budget for death and destruction for the Pentagon is almost $1 trillion. And when you look at real military spending, it's about $1.5 trillion. This is in a time when homelessness is soaring, when people can't make ends meet, when inflation is ravaging the working class. Again, we go through this election cycle every 4 years, and the presentation is made, this is a life and death question. I want to ask you this. Trump is clearly distancing himself a little bit from Project 2025, that 900-page report from the Heritage Foundation, which calls for basically an undoing of what they call the administrative state, or what we might call undoing all of the progressive reforms that have been achieved by the labor upsurge of the 1930s, or the upsurge of Black America in the 1960s. They're trying to roll all of that back. Trump is trying to distance himself from that, which doesn't mean it's not his real program. At the same time, the RNC has adopted a very right-wing program, along with some, sort of little demagogic caveats that are designed to sort of appease working class people who can't pay high prices. I just want to get your sense of it. I mean, here we can expect now a Donald Trump White House, perhaps a landslide victory. I don't think this is actually, quote, fascism coming to power. I do think it will be a challenge, but it really is up to what people do, what the working class does, what young people do, what the left does, rather than waiting on the sidelines as spectators to see which of the two evil candidates gets selected. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of points. I mean, first and foremost, let's remember that the civil rights movement emerged under fascism. We don't really discuss it like that at all, but the Jim Crow South was a fascist dictatorship, and thousands of people rose up heroically in the mist and the reality of fascist dictatorship, murder, Klan, all this kind of stuff that we know. So, I mean, the idea that somehow social movements and progressive movements of people lose all agency, even in an extremely right-wing fascist ideology, analogy make no sense to me. I mean, if you look, and I think people should go back and do this history at the service department of the Ford Motor Company run by Harry Bennett and the fascist tactics that they used against the union there in Ford, well, that failed. And despite the fact that in 1932, they shot down the Ford workers, despite the fact that they had every form of stool pigeon and everything like that, and Henry Ford, by the way, was a fascist and a supporter of Hitler, nonetheless, the CIO prevailed. So I don't want to underplay this issue, but I do think it's important for us to recognize and to also continue to uplift the fact that the social movements that people look to in the history of this country, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the abolitionist movement, the Harriet Tubmans of the world, so on and so forth. I mean, all of these people were facing conditions that, I would argue that even if Project 2025 was fully implemented, would still, in fact, not be as bad as many of the situations in which these individuals emerge. So whatever happens, however bad it is, however far right it is, I think the idea that we should just despair and think that there's nothing we can do is totally incorrect. And I think that we have to push back against that very heavily in terms of what it really will take to move the country. But I think there's also some deeper points here. I mean, first and foremost, and I'm glad you referenced Reagan, and when people talk about they're trying to get rid of all the things from the civil rights movement, all the things from the labor rights movement. Well, I mean, when have the Republicans since Reagan not been trying to do that? I mean, the entire Republican Party program since the Reagan presidency has been exactly that, to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement, to roll back the gains of the labor movement, to roll back the gains of the women's rights movement, and they've moved aggressively to do so. Some of the things have only come to fruition, recently, for instance, the taking away of a woman's right to choose, but especially around civil rights and labor rights, I mean, these things have been constantly under attack by Republicans, and on top of that, Democrats have also helped facilitate some of these points. It was Bill Clinton, of course, who pioneered the tough on border issues, and that was in context with his broader quote-unquote law and order push. I could argue that Bill Clinton actually achieved more than Ronald Reagan, who wanted to achieve the same thing in terms of implementing law and order policies that destroyed the black community. It was Bill Clinton that we restructured so-called welfare, which even of itself, the name welfare, I think, is a psychological op, but anyway, let's not go there. He dismantled welfare, which obviously was a huge, or at least restructured it in a way that had significant impacts on child poverty, as he was told at the time by, many Democrats. That, of course, was a historic legacy of the Democratic Party. I mean, I could go on and on and on all these different points, but just to say, I think the essentializing of Project 2025, it's not that it's not bad, it's just that this is actually not that different from the Republican Party program basically since Ronald Reagan. And it's essentially the exact same things that they've tried to put forward since that time. And again, as I point out, some of which have, of course, been facilitated by the Democratic Party. So I think we have to also recognize that the Republican Party, I mean, you could maybe go back before Reagan, but let's just say from the post-Reagan era, really maybe even since Reagan's primary run in 1976, has in fact been primarily focused on this one piece. And that is to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement, the labor movement, and so on and so forth. Why is that the case? Because the Republican Party, under the leadership of Reagan, following his primary insurgency in 1976, has become the principal, not the only, but the principal instrument of the capitalist class to push back against policies that they viewed to be, hindering their profitability. I mean, there was a crisis in the 1970s in the broader sort of governance of capitalism because capitalism was losing dynamism. That was when capitalism decided they needed to put in new policies. We've started to call those policies neoliberalism, the globalization of labor and the destruction of the industrial base of the United States, a drive against unions, massive deregulation and privatization, the increase of military spending and war, which is designed to make sure that any country around the world that had any different ideas about how the world should be governed, that they would be pushed to the side, suppressed, or completely and totally destroyed. Some of this started under Jimmy Carter, but it wasn't coherent under Carter. Reagan brought in a coherent program to implement what we've known as neoliberalism, which also included the rise of mass incarceration, understanding that they would be creating significant social problems and consequences in the black community in America, and they needed to contain the social fallout from that time. So this, from Reagan to Trump, and Trump, of course, a big admirer of Reagan, although Reagan was not apparently much of an admirer of Trump, has been the general idea. This is why Donald Trump had the $1 trillion transfer of wealth to the capitalists through his so-called tax cut program. This is why Donald Trump was against all all regulations that could do anything for workers or for unions and just totally eviscerating them. This is why Donald Trump served the interest of the climate, the oil companies and others, regardless of what the impact is on the climate. This is the program of the Republican Party, whether they call it Project 2025, Project 2020, Project 1996, Project 1994, Contract on America, so-called Contract with America by Newt Gingrich. You will actually see the core issues are exactly the same, because for the capitalist class in America, they are trying to move things in a direction to increase their own profitability. And that's the final thing I'll say here, Brian, before I go back to you. We have to understand the shift to the right is structural. It's not personal. It's not just because a bunch of bad people got into power, but the political center of the country was deliberately shifted to the right by the big money interests who control politics in America, because they wanted to make sure that they could have even more money, even more riches, and even more wealth. And they want to make sure that there's nothing that can push back against that. So they have increasingly empowered the Republican Party and the right-wing movements around it principally, but they have also captured elements of the Democratic Party. It's been called different things: Blue Dog Democrats, the New Democratic Network, and so on and so forth, to help shift the overall political center of gravity, the red lines of what you can and cannot say, further and further to the right. And that is why we have to understand, when we think about what the threat of fascism is in the United States, in America, that voting for the Democrats will not stop it, because the Democratic shift to the right is helping to drive the growth of the actual far-right, the actual semi-fascist and fascist forces in this country. I'll just give you one or two examples here. I mean, first and foremost, we know for a fact, going back to the history of the Ku Klux Klan, that the history of the inner connections between, the fascist forces and the state police forces and so on and so forth, the federal, the FBI and others, has been a key part in sort of incubating this. Well, Biden, of course, wants to increase money to the Border Patrol that's collaborating with these unbelievable border vigilante fascist networks. He himself, in his very garbled response of what he's doing for Black America, noted that he wanted to put 100,000 cops on the street. All of the cops, by the way, all of their unions who support Trump 100%, and who, as we saw, were willing to collude with groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, whose entire appeal was that they were in fact sheriffs and cops in order to build out the extra legal far-right networks to suppress protesters and so on and so forth. And you can see just right there that those two policies are heavily increasing the actual infrastructure that will help these far-right vigilante forces, where there's a blurred line between them, continue to grow and continue to strengthen themselves. Because the other key policies that you can see that are out there that are driving the growth of the far right, the contradictions that exist in the world. I mean, you look at Biden pushing the bloc politics against China. I don't want to get too deep into it, but the reality is the estimates from economists have noted that the division of the world into firm economic blocs, with the U.S. on one side and China on the other side, will reduce global growth by 7 to 12%. So the world will become poorer, the world will become hungrier, and the world will ultimately become more divided. The fact that we will have less collaboration with China on climate change will also mean that climate issues will continue to increase in a major way, even if Biden wins re-election and promotes solutions that don't meet the scale of the problem. Well, you look at what the far right and the fascist forces are actually capitalizing on. Immigration, that will drastically increase if the world is poorer, hungrier, and the climate change is forcing people's livelihoods out of existence. If you look at the issue of the feeling of economic mismanagement in the country, that will only increase people's feelings of that the economy is being mismanaged. I could go on and on in this point, but you can see that even if you say vote for Biden, the fact that he's not promoting solutions that meet the scale of the problem create the gray area that can be exploited by the far right and the fascist forces. So ultimately, people are saying Project 2025, it's obviously terrible, it's obviously bad, but this is the long-term agenda of the right wing of the capitalist class that is driving the agenda, that's bringing the Democrats along with them, that's creating the space that's being exploited by fascists. So no matter who wins in November, whether it be Biden or Trump, the far right will grow, the semi-fascists will grow, the fascists will absolutely grow, and ultimately the country will continue to spiral downward, because neither party is actually proposing solutions that can solve the problems that affect people. And ultimately, we see these are the moments that the most odious political forces are able to capitalize.
Right, and that's why I think it's so important to build a socialist movement, and a movement that's independent from the two capitalist parties, a working class movement, a progressive movement, a movement especially based on young people who are always the agents of change. I want to pick up on some of the points that you made, Eugene, and just sort of, I don't know, sort of think through some of those items, and I want our audience to kind of wrap their head around some of this too. You mentioned that neoliberalism actually started under Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is this icon of the Republicans who are now pretending to be the great friend of the working man and of ordinary America. And they want to make America great again for workers, et cetera. All this demagogy. But when you think about what Reagan was actually doing, nationally, trying to encourage or support corporations going to other countries where they could pay workers lower wages. I mean, that's really what neoliberalism basically boils down to: shipping production offshore, going to Mexico or going to China or going, where, in different places in the global south, because they could pay workers a lot less. They could make the products, similar or same products, and because of new technologies, information communication, the high tech revolution, they could ship those same products back to the metropole, back to the mainland, back to the imperialist center. So you had a situation where large numbers of workers, I'm talking about millions of workers, in especially Midwestern cities, the industrial belt that became known as the Rust Belt. It didn't just rust. I mean, Reagan and his successors, including George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton, they made it rusty because they closed those factories down. They shipped them over, they allowed them to be shipped overseas. They did that so the capitalists could make lots of money. Then you have a situation like in Detroit, which is completely devastated by the offshoring of production to global South countries. And you have Joe Biden and the Republicans teaming up for the Criminal Justice Reform Act in 1994 that basically doubled the prison population. Just as you said, if you don't need workers in urban areas, well, lock up their children. That's one way to get rid of a surplus population or labor that's now become redundant. And then at the same time, you have Bill Clinton signing NAFTA in 1994, or it took effect January 1st, 1994. That allowed U.S. corporations to additionally move to other places, including to Mexico. Of course, the Zapatistas had an uprising against NAFTA on January 1st in southern Mexico. They said it would be a death sentence for indigenous corn growers, corn farmers in the southern part of Mexico. And in fact, it was, which led to massive migration of Mexicans to the United States. But then the Democratic Party started losing its base, Eugene. I mean, the Democratic Party leadership, as servants of Wall Street, pursuing the same neoliberal policy as the Republicans and Reagan, undermined the industrial heartland of the country, which had been the Democratic Party voting base. All of this done in the service of Wall Street. All of this done in the service of, like mass or maximizing profits for the capitalists. Now, there was another element of this, which you're also touching on, and I want to tie this all together, which is the underlying issue of racism. You had Reagan starting his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Why start there? And why start there with the slogan, "The South will rise again," which is what his campaign was talking about? Well, that's the place where the three civil rights workers, who you just wrote a major article about for Liberation News, that's where they were slaughtered. That's where they were massacred. That was a sign that Trump was moving towards this very heavily dosed racist campaign. Reagan also said we have to get rid of welfare because there are, quote, welfare queens. Well, that was an attack, not a dog whistle, almost a blatant, brazen attack against the Black community and against Black women, against Black moms. And then you have Bill Clinton, not Reagan, actually ending welfare as we know it, as you pointed out. That was in 1996 when they cut off 10 million people from benefits overnight, and 7 million of them were children. dramatically increasing poverty for those people, those communities that no longer had access to industrial jobs. If you put this history together and then talk to working class people and say, yeah, but we got to vote for the Democrats. We have to vote for Biden because he's not Trump, because he's not the Republicans. It ignores the real history here, which is the thing you're pointing out, that the move to the right is a structural move by the ruling class. And the only way we can actually combat it is to build a socialist movement, a working class movement, a labor movement that can fight back. And I think that's what's coming. Go ahead.
No, I think that's a good point. And I mean, just to give people two more, elements of this, I mean, when you look at, say, for instance, the rise of so-called critical infrastructure laws to protect, energy infrastructure against basically people protesting climate change. If you look at the rise of cop cities all around this country, I mean, people have probably heard about Atlanta, but they're all around the country. I mean, you can actually see that these were both extremely bipartisan policies, especially the cop city thing, which in some ways is more led by Democrats than by Republicans. But the reason I think it's important to recognize that it's a bipartisan policy because it shows that actually both major parties are preparing at the state and local level, especially for not resolving the issues around all of the critical things facing society. They know they're actually not going to really resolve any of the issues around climate change in a way that's going to prevent things, or at least they don't plan on it, that's actually going to resolve the issue of climate change. And thus they know that people will end up taking more drastic action like they did at places like Standing Rock, like they did at places like Line 3 in order to try to save humanity and save the planet. So they pass in a bipartisan way a bunch of laws to make these egregious felonies with decades and decades in prison. These mayors of all of these major cities, many of them, almost all of them Democrats, in fact, many of them black Democrats, in fact, know very well that the social consequences for black people in the major cities, especially young people, are not going to be resolved. And thus their rebelliousness is going to continue to grow. And the Fergusons, the Baltimores, the Minneapolis, and the uprisings will continue to move forward. And so they are moving forward with their plan to put in more repressive forces to contain that policy. And I'll add on top of that, that when you listen to the Republican National Convention on the issue of quote unquote crime, the Republicans sound just like Eric Adams, London Breed, Andre Dickens, Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., and many of these other mayors who have the exact same rhetoric, which is also pushing the country further and further to the right. But you can see that structurally, both parties are preparing for the fact that neither of them have solutions to meet the scale of the problems that exist. Many of their policies will actually accelerate the challenges and the problems that exist, and that they have to strengthen the repressive forces to contain the outrage and the anger of what is going on. And as you said towards the end there, the issue of a revived labor movement or working class movement has to be one that is factoring into this as well. And I think it's factoring into the context of how they're even messaging. I mean, you look at the propaganda that's coming from both parties. One thing I think is interesting, and one thing I think actually should be heartening to the working class people who are fighting back in every way they can, is both the Republicans and the Democrats now all of a sudden, in America, it's very rare that people speak to the working class as a political subject. Almost never, actually. I mean, in the post-World War II era, there is no working class, right? Everyone's either poor or middle class. But putting that aside for the time being, Democrats and Republicans, working class, working class, working class. Biden and Trump, working class, working class, working class, working class, working class. Now, these are two massive billionaire-run entities. They have access to all of the possible data you could ever want. So what else could you really take from that other than to say that obviously society is becoming more class conscious? And in a society where 85% of people are saying they're having at least some difficulty meeting their expenses week to week, 1/5, by the way, saying they're having a very great amount of difficulty finding their expenses, meeting their expenses week to week. In a society where 69% of people told a New York Times poll they think the economy needs either major transformation or to be totally torn down. In a place that we have seen the UAW and the Teamsters have big contract fights. We've seen big corporations like Starbucks have waves of unionization sweep off of them. We've seen multiple different uprisings in black communities all across the country. We've seen the immigrant rights movement emerge. It seems pretty obvious that the two major parties recognize if they want to continue to push their agenda, which does not help workers at all, they can't try to speak to them in an oblique way. They have to try to speak to them as workers and say, we are helping the working class, because they recognize the anger that exists and that is causing people to get more class conscious, to see things as class against class, themselves versus the elites. And so in addition to preparing the repressive apparatus, as I was just mentioning about, they're also shifting their propaganda to try to co-opt as many working class people as possible into their two various political camps, because they recognize that the issues are sharpening and that their billionaire donors that control their two major parties could be in trouble unless they try to disrupt those trends. So at the end of the day, I think it's a good sign that all of these various forms of fight back are affecting the capitalist class. It's raising their fears. It's raising their fears that they will be overthrown directly, thus why they're strengthening the repressive forces to try to send people to jail and shoot them down in the street. They're worried that it's going to affect them indirectly, which is why they're shifting their political consciousness, because they recognize their political messaging, because they recognize that third parties that have a real working class agenda could in fact emerge, and that there is an increasing desire of people to move in that direction. You have 30 to 40% of the country saying they sympathize with socialism. So you can already see in an indirect way and a direct way that they are fearing that the fight back of working class people could affect the stability of their system. Not just the stability, their ability to rule in general over everything that's happening. So to me, it seems to say that strengthening of unions, the growth of unions, strengthening of organizations that are fighting against police terrorism, strengthening the role of those who are fighting for the rights of immigrants, and I could go on and on. People can get what I'm saying. Strengthening the role of the climate change movement, that all of these things are critically important. They are critically important and more important in terms of turning around the direction of the country. If you want to have a radical course correction in where the country is going, it can only happen when there's a clear political pole that's actually speaking not just to the problems, but the scale of the problems. That's certainly not the Republicans. It's not going to be the Democrats. It's only going to be an independent movement of working class people. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when people say, well, that can't happen. Well, if everyone says it can never happen, it'll never happen. People said for many years, you could never change the South. You could never change the things around civil rights in America. Too late, it's in. But people said, you know what? No, we're going to do that. People said, you're never going to end slavery. But people said, you know what? We're going to go for that. And in fact, when you look at the history of the civil rights movement, you look at the history of the labor movement, you look at the history of the abolitionist movement, it always starts the same way. That the people who are the most, who claim to care about this, and this is where I put a lot of liberals and civil rights, liberals and people who support the Democrats, the people who claim to care about these issues, oh, we're against slavery, oh, we're for unions, oh, we're for civil rights, they always say to people who say, well, we have to move more boldly and more aggressively and outside of the existing political establishment. Oh, you're unrealistic. Oh, that'll never work. Oh, there's no way that you're ever going to be able to overcome this. They always say that. It's always a small group of people with a clear sense of purpose who say we're going to break out of the two-party establishment paradigm in this country and boldly set out a political pole to challenge slavery, to fight for the rights of workers, to fight against Jim Crow, who start these movements that actually end up succeeding. It never starts because some president comes down from on high. It certainly never starts because some Democratic Party, or if we're in the abolitionist era, some Whig Party, political hack, is able to conduct and concoct some, way to influence the president or whatever to make this happen. It happens because people build movements from the grassroots, from the ground up, which means several things. I mean, it means that it is a big challenge. It means that the payoff isn't right away. It also means that you are, demonized, jailed, or killed. I mean, all these things are true. But if you look at how slavery ended, and I'll end on this note, 1850s. In 1850, you had the Compromise of 1850, the rise of the Fugitive Slave Act. The slave power was more powerful than it had ever been. The major political party system started to break down because people wanted to be against slavery, but there are a lot of ideas about how that could happen, and there were other issues that were involved. You end up with 3-4 parties that are vying. But I just want to make this note. Society in the lead up to 1860 became significantly more violent. I mean, you had the Kansas issue, Bleeding Kansas, and what was happening there. You had the rise of vigilance committees all across the North, which people should study and learn about, especially as we consider the issue of immigration, where people, to prevent fugitive slaves and non-slaves being kidnapped and taken back to the South, armed themselves and many times would raid courthouses and physically remove people and fight and sometimes do great damage to these pro-slavery slavery bounty hunters who were coming in the North. And then, of course, it is, part of the thing culminates in 1860. You have the Civil War. Not that I'm saying we need to move towards the Civil War, but it's just to go to my earlier point. In terms of how change is really going to be made in this country, it's not just an issue of preventing people little by little, vote against the worst possible thing. It's chaos and turmoil happens because we're talking about the entrenched interests being challenged in a real way. And if your idea is that we can only make change in circumstances that are seemingly more favorable, you're wrong. Change is often made in situations that are very unfavorable to those who want to make change. And so you can't just look at, we have to vote for the Democrats because I'd rather fight in a Biden administration than a Trump administration, as if that guarantees success. Well, it doesn't guarantee success, and history will prove to you that it does not guarantee success. I mean, in the 1950s, the Democrats, who would later support civil rights, were worse than Eisenhower on civil rights. I mean, in 1956, Eisenhower, who did nothing really for civil rights, but he started campaigning with Jackie Robinson, and he invited him to come sit in his box at a baseball game. And the whole reason he did that is because he knew that Adlai Stevenson, because of the Dixiecrats, could not appear socially with a black person. And so even though he did nothing for them, he was able just through optics to appear as better to black voters. And many of these Democrats claim to be liberals who were for civil rights. And ultimately, some of them would go on to support civil rights in the 1960s. But to say if you voted for Adlai Stevenson and the Democrats somehow is going to be better for civil rights, I mean, it's not a great analogy, to be honest with you, because the 50s was very different. But the point I'm trying to make is this idea that somehow you're favorable. I mean, I think when a lot of people voted for Clinton in 1992, they didn't expect a lot of the things that he did. Certainly trade unions didn't expect a lot of the things that he did. I don't think the black population, even though there were some indications, expected it to be as bad as it was. So there's a logical fallacy that's built in here, I think, about the lesser of two evil politics that is necessarily better. I mean, before 2020 election, I was on a show, the Katie Halper Show, where I debated with someone who said I was a terrible person. I wanted Iranian children to die because Biden was going to be better on Iran. Well, what happened there? And ultimately, I think we can go down the list and see many of these things.
Yeah, indeed. I want to also go back to the issue of the Democrats in this case. We have Joe Biden, obviously. The New York Times, all the mainstream capitalist newspapers are now talking about this, Biden is like the mad king surrounded by this tight-knit group of advisors, all of whom are making tons of money because they run advertising companies or they're lawyers who are consultants with advertising companies, and they make millions and millions of dollars if Biden runs because they're going to get the TV ads. And they're telling him, and Jill Biden is telling him, Joe, you're doing great. You know all the facts. Don't worry. You're the guy. And he's such a megalomaniac. He's actually just like Donald Trump. He's also, like Trump, a pathological liar. He always accuses Trump of being a pathological liar. But just look at Biden's campaign over the years. He always makes stuff up. They always call it his making a big story. Anyway, they're just lies. He's lying. He's a plagiarist. He's a liar. And he's a megalomaniac. It's so obvious now to everybody, as the new favorite pastime in the United States is to watch Joe Biden clips. I'm going to share one about how he says he was the greatest thing ever for Palestinians in Gaza. He was the greatest thing because he's the guy, Eugene. But also, when you talk about lesser evil and you talk about the danger of fascism or the danger of a more repressive government in the United States, the current government, the Biden administration, is, if you believe the chants that maybe the same people who might consider voting for Biden have been chanting, which is Genocide Joe, how can you vote for somebody who is actually carrying out a genocide? But Biden is so bad that he actually thinks he's a great friend of the Palestinian people. I mean, I want to play this clip and then I want to talk about it a little bit with you, but I don't want to divorce the class struggle in the United States or the fight for democracy in the United States, the fight to expand reforms that are needed by the population, economic, social, or political reforms, from the role of U.S. imperialism overseas. Because if we think of ourselves as internationalists, as socialists, when we think of the Palestinian people, I think we should say we are one with the Palestinian people. We are part of the same family. It's the same human family. And for huge parts, the biggest part of the human family are exploited and oppressed people. They're part of, the working class, or that part of the population that has suffered from colonization, semi-colonization, extreme racism. Like, we should be with the Palestinians and thinking of their struggle as our struggle. And I think more and more people are starting to do that. Anyway, let's play this clip. This is amazing. Joe Biden talking about how he's such a great friend of Palestine.
I'm the guy that did more for the Palestinian community than anybody. I'm the guy that opened up all the assets. I'm the guy that made sure that I got the Egyptians to open the border to let good goods through, medicine and food but what's happening is, and I'm the guy that's been able to pull together the Arab states to agree to help the Palestinians with food and shelter. I'm the guy, and so it's not. I mean,
it's so gross. I mean, Eugene, first of all, his number one refrain about all things is how I'm the guy, showing that he is, in fact, a megalomaniac. Jill Biden and this tight knit of grifter advisors who are encouraging him to keep going, in spite of the fact that almost all of the Democratic voters want him to leave and know he's going to get creamed in the election. But this megalomania, it's just like Donald Trump. I think it's also an indication of the state of a political system when people like Biden and Trump are the best you can hope to choose from. I mean, first it was Hillary Clinton, a disgraceful candidate, an awful candidate, not because of her personal qualities, but because she's such a creature of the capitalist system. She actually thinks that people voting for Trump are a basket of deplorables because they're unlike her rich so-called liberal friends. I mean, she and Bill were always partying with Trump and Melania. They're part of the same class. But these people, for ordinary working class folks, other than voting against the, quote, greater evil, they're not appealing. But when you think about what Biden just said, that he's the guy, and he helped the Palestinians so much. I mean, how do you, it would be like Nazis talking about how they had done great things for Jews in Germany or Eastern Europe because they provided some more aid for the work camps, which became death camps. I mean, what is Gaza now? Before we called it an outdoor prison, it's a death camp now. I mean, when you have this level of this number of the population either killed or terribly wounded, that's what's going on. It is genocide. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, I'm the guy who's really helping Palestinians. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing, and worth noting to your point about the Nazis. I mean, that was Adolf Eichmann's argument, right, when he was on trial in Israel in the 1960s, is he was like, well, I know it looks bad, but if you look at what I did, I was helping them. I wasn't the worst. All these other people, I was giving people transit permits. I was doing this. I mean, and it was so absurd. Obviously, we're talking about Adolf Eichmann, one of the handmaidens of the Holocaust, but it's, that was still his argument. And I have to say, and, these parallels can be a little bit fraught, it does sound similar when you hear what Biden is saying, because he's basically saying, since I'm not the worst of the genocidaires, which I don't even know if that's true, but that's what he's arguing, I'm not the worst of the genocidaires, you actually have to give me credit for it. But he's saying I'm the one who's getting food and medicine. I mean, his own agency, USAID, is warning about famine and hunger that is existing and will continue to grow inside of Gaza. The World Food Program, which is headed up by Cindy McCain, so not exactly Che Guevara, is also warning about the existence and the growth of famine and hunger. Every single international aid agency, from the UN to the International Red Cross to every other one you could imagine, has said the level of food, water, medicine being brought into the Gaza Strip is totally inadequate, and that it is a humanitarian catastrophe in every possible way. So ultimately, he has not done these things that he was claiming he was doing in that interview for Complex Magazine. He has not, in fact, helped ease the humanitarian situation of the people in the Gaza Strip. And on top of that, of course, he's been the number one funder of all of this war from the very beginning. He has been the primary person who has been shielding Israel from any form of accountability inside of the United Nations. I mean, it's so absurd on every level. It was why I couldn't help but think about the Eichmann parallel. And I know some people don't like that, but look at the number of people who have been murdered in Gaza deliberately by the Israelis with the backing of the Americans. The people who are dying of hunger, the people who are dying of thirst. Every single hospital has basically been completely destroyed. Every single university has basically been completely destroyed. And the clip that we're seeing on the scene here, right after, not that long after October 7th, of Biden hugging Bibi, I mean, the whole situation is just outrageous. And on top of that, the fact that that interview was with Complex magazine, so it was aimed towards younger people. Complex is sort of a hip hop magazine who have been at the forefront of those who have been opposing this genocide in Gaza, is even more astounding because they know that that's not true. So it's a massive slap in the face of basically saying that all people who are concerned about what's going on in Gaza are just ignorant. I mean, they're just stupid. And if they just knew the facts, they would be supporting him. I mean, it's honestly insane. And to go to your deeper point about the role of imperialism, I mean, you know, I already quoted the statistic about the new Cold War with China, the issue of the economic blocks, the fact that they will reduce global GDP by 7 to 12%, the fact that it's going to mean that the world is going to be poorer, that it's going to be hungrier, that it's going to be more divided, that it's going to be less cooperating on issues like climate change and so on and so forth. I already mentioned that, but I think we can put the Palestinian cause in that context. I mean, first and foremost, it's just morally correct. I mean, what's being done, the genocide in Gaza, regardless of anything else, has to be opposed. I mean, I just don't even want to say more about that. If you don't agree with that, then just turn off the show right now, because I don't know what to say to convince you at this point. But ultimately, the whole reason they're doing it is because of imperialism's attempt to divide and control the world. I mean, this started under Obama, right, with the so-called pivot to Asia. We have to disengage from the Middle East. What's the precondition for disengaging with the Middle East? From Obama's perspective, it was to introduce a sort of Cold War-ish balance of power between, you know, Iran and those affiliated with Iran, friendly with Iran, and this Israel-centered bloc based on normalization of Arab states that, until recently, you know, were 100% opposed to Iran. So to have Israel's role as the guarantor of U.S. interests in the Middle East, of which it's always been, it was British imperialism first, then the issue of the U.S., to actually strengthen that role, strengthen their position in any way that they would be able to kind of balance each other out, and the U.S. should go to Asia. So I've said from the very beginning, the reason that Biden is supporting this genocide is not, you know, because he's controlled by Israel, but that in fact, they have the exact same goals as Israel. Maybe they could be a little less extreme, they could give a little bit more to the Palestinians, but at the end of the day, they recognize the Palestinian people are their number one stumbling block to pulling off the pivot to Asia, which is all about controlling the entire world, because the Palestinian people will not allow them to resolve this issue inside of the Middle East around normalization. Even Saudi Arabia, you know, very close to the United States. There's no doubt about that. But they can't survive if they normalize with Israel. And they said they'll only do it if there's a deal given to the Palestinian people. But the Palestinian people will not capitulate. And they're saying, we'll deal, but we'll only deal if our rights are recognized under the United Nations and under morality. So that has held that issue up. And so they want to find a way, the United States, to destroy the resolve and break the back of the Palestinian people through this genocide, and then to use that also to force the Israelis to make a deal, a fake deal, basically a sellout neo-colonial deal in Palestine, so that they can get Saudi Arabia to normalize, so that they can set up their own little bloc, that they can have it be a check on the block of Iran, which can't be controlled by the United States, and they can send more of their billions of dollars of military equipment to Asia to try to surround China. So all of this is a part of a broader plot by U.S. imperialism in the context of what I've said since Reagan and the rise of neoliberalism, to counteract the fact that the richest people in America, despite the fact that they're richer than anyone has ever been in the history of the globe, have to get even richer at all cost. And they are trying to control and divide the world, no matter what the consequences are for everyone everyone else. And that not only means that the Palestinian people are suffering, but that people in Cuba are suffering from a sanctions regime, in Venezuela, in Iran, and all of these other countries. It means that people in the United States are suffering because instead of addressing climate change between the US and China, we're actually trying to keep their solar panels out and kneecap their economy, so we can't address that. So it all comes together into one piece. It's not a separate piece. It's the overall strategy of US imperialism, which is pushing the United States and the whole world off a cliff. And the subsidiary responses to this issue are the things that are being capitalized on by the fascist forces inside of the United States and the growth of the far right in many ways. So you have to put the thing together. You have to put all the pieces together. I mean, it's the Democrats, it's the Republicans, and they're leading us down a terrible, terrible path that is hurting so many people around the world, and that ultimately is actually creating the space. Because, and I'll just say this about the far right, and then I'll close. Even though they have no agenda to these problems, for these problems, in the context of people feeling increasingly hopeless about the fact that nothing ever seems to change, as Biden said to rich donors in 2020, nothing will fundamentally change, means that the appearance of radicalism that is put forward by the far right, whether we're talking about Trump or the Nazis, becomes attractive to people who are looking to shake up the system. And that's how you can see that when you look at the polls of swing voters, that even though 60% of them want to have more spending on social programs and higher taxes on the rich, and 52% of them are willing to accept non-traditional cultural, gender, social beliefs that people have in this country, and these are obviously not Trump's policies, that a plurality of these individuals actually are supporting Trump because they feel like, oh, he's going to shake it up. He's going to shake it up. And I think ultimately you can see the impact and the appeal of that over time, even though it's totally fake, and they're only going to make the problems worse. But I say that just to say that when people are saying, well, Trump is no solution, you're right, Trump is no solution, but he appears like a solution in the context of a totally static status quo and people's lives getting worse and worse, and the inability of them to feel like they have any control over the direction of where they're going.
I want to stay with this, Eugene, and I think for people who are maybe tuning in for the first time to this show, we are the Socialist Program. I'm a Marxist. You are a Marxist. You are a socialist. We have what Marxists would call a worldview. So instead of looking at the United States separate from China, separate from Palestine, separate from South Africa, separate from Cuba or Venezuela, we try to look at it as an integrated whole. And our position, our view, is that in order to really understand world politics, not because we want to understand, but because we want to change world politics, it's important to have this kind of materialist and dialectical sort of overview or comprehensive view of the world in its totality because of the interconnectedness of issues. I want to just stay with this a little bit because I think you're hitting on a really important point in terms of how socialists or activists or organizers or people who don't define themselves yet ideologically but want change, how they should go about their own sort of perspective, their political perspective, because ideas matter and our perspective matters. It's not, we can't simply be organizers and activists. We have to have ideas and perspective and a worldview. So I want to go back and sort of, if I can, very briefly, kind of recap some of the important points that you've touched on in this conversation, Eugene. We had the capitalist class during the 1980s, especially. It started a little bit before, but especially during the Reagan era, adopt this neoliberal position whereby, in order to maximize corporate profits, they sort of promoted the idea that corporations should leave the United States and set up factories and enterprises in other parts of the world where they could pay workers a lower wage. And that was good for Wall Street, good for the corporations, good for the capitalists. And then part of that was they were looking at China because China is was at that time 1/4 of the human race, a very big market and a very big labor market. And so large numbers of US corporations went to China, began doing business in China, made super profits from doing business in China. But because China is not a neo-colonial regime, because it is led by a communist party, even when it introduced the opening to Western corporations, even when it introduced or allowed some capitalist market relations to thrive, they still maintained control of the state. And they made the decision that they were going to allow the capitalists in the West to do business in China, but then they, the Chinese, would get hold of the technology. They would learn the technology. They would acquire it. It would transfer. They would accumulate that knowledge. They would break the monopoly on technology, especially high technology. And here we are 30 years later, Eugene, or say in 2011, when Obama announced the Asia pivot, the thing that you're talking about. China had become so strong as a consequence of the fact that the U.S. was bogged down in endless losing wars in the Middle East. China could rise peacefully. China took advantage of the space. China had acquired the technology. It wasn't a neo-colonial regime. And China became a competitor economically on the global scene with the United States. And then Obama decides to pivot to Asia, means let's have an arms deal with Iran. Let's try to get out of the Middle East. Let's withdraw troops from Iraq. He tried to stop the process whereby the U.S. is endlessly bogged down in losing wars and pivot to a confrontation in China. Not a pivot to peace. It was a pivot to confrontation with China. And the thing that they needed to do, as you're pointing out, and I'm just emphasizing this so it sinks in for everybody, in order to make that final thing happen, to be able to pivot to Asia, they had to get rid of the, quote, Palestinian question, meaning they had to make it clear to the Palestinians that they would never, ever, ever be free, that they would never be able to have the right of return, that the colonial project would have decimated and succeeded in Palestine as it did, say, in North America against indigenous people during those terrible centuries. But the Palestinians kept fighting and are still fighting, still resisting. So the attempt to normalize with U.S. client regimes like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, the rest of them, that never happened. The Palestinian resistance basically sort of made that impossible. And then the U.S. is now back in this endless war. It's a losing war for U.S. and Israel, succeeding in killing a lot of Palestinians, but Israel won't succeed in eliminating the Palestinian resistance. So we're in the same cycle. And that's what I think what you're saying, Eugene, is so important. We, the people who want change, who are working for change, who may identify as socialists, we have to have a world view and not think of the United States in isolation. It has to be integrated. And when you look at the world and you look at the trends in the world, there's a lot of reason to be positive and optimistic. But what we do in the United States, the struggle that we wage, and now we see there's been this huge, massive movement for Palestine in the last 9 or 10 months. What we do can make a difference, and it can get even bigger than what's happened in the last 9 or 10 months once it starts to focus also on the massive deprivations that working class people, the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of workers in America are facing. We have a lot of opportunity if we're guided by a worldview, determined to win, knowing that we can build alliances, build united fronts, and know who our real enemy is, which of course is the capitalist system. It's not Trump per se or Biden per se. It's the two-party capitalist system and the economic system that really is the foundation of it. Saying all that, Eugene, I want to go back to you. I think you've really helped us focus on this issue of worldview and how we as organizers should be looking at the world.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, and I think that this is something we also, looking at the world, we have to look strategically. I mean, in the most immediate sense, you can argue that, yes, you need a sort of broad united front of different types of people to counter the rising surge of the far right, which is happening all across the world. And by the way, they're all working together and talking to each other on a regular basis, these far right, semi-fascist and fascist forces. So that's worth noting. But, you look at, for instance, what took place in Colombia and President Petro, and we could make our critiques there, but certainly a vast improvement over essentially the fascistic style government that had been ruling there for decades and decades and decades. You can look at the broad movement that defeated Bolsonaro, who was very scary in his rise there in Brazil and pushing sort of a fascistic policy. Unfortunately, they were not able to defeat Mr. Modi, but we can look at what has happened in India with the reduction in the seats from the point of view of the BJP. Obviously, you can look at what happened with the new Popular Front in France. Also, we could raise our critiques, but relevant. They're winning more seats than the National Rally when everyone said that these, fascist-rooted forces were going to win. What is the common denominator there? there. The common denominator is that the defeats and the near defeats for the far right were in fact not rooted in a Democratic Party style centrist milquetoast politics. They were rooted in clear contrasts that were anchored in the understanding of the need to temper the role of capitalists both locally and the broader sort of imperialist capitalist class, and to push a more people first as opposed to more profit first policy. Now, again, there's many contradictions and many critiques, but that's the broad trend there. And of course, people rallied to that. But in addition to those sorts of politics, for it to be embedded in social movements, Modi's defeat was really a defeat that was pushed forward by the farmers of India, who rose up in a fantastic way in 2020 and 2021 and helped galvanize a mass movement that included workers of all types and mass unions, and was able to combine with the struggle of others, especially those who were struggling around civil liberties, in order to deliver a significant upsurge in politics. In France, you had the mass movement that was taking place of workers against the pension reform. You had the huge role of the Gaza protest movement. In Brazil, you had the MST, 1 million strong. You had the workers and the unions that had been on the street. In Colombia, you had this broad mass of millions of people brought together in many different social movements and so on and so forth. But the point I am making here is if you have a clear contrast with the rightward shift, the structural rightward shift, not just the far right policies, but making these far right semi-fascistic, in the case of many of these countries, outright fascistic policies, making those people and parties representative of a deeper, broader structural shift conducted by them and by many so-called centrists and many so-called liberals. If you have a clear contrast with that and say that we are opposed to the structural shift to the right, and we want to impose policies that will pull things back in the direction of people first over profit first, that then you have the basis by which policy-wise you can fight back. And if those policies are embedded in huge mass social movements that have millions of people, then you can start to pull society back in the other direction. That's why Modi didn't see it coming. The day before the election, he said, we're going to win 400 seats. Didn't happen. The national rally, everyone around the world said Le Pen is going to win. Didn't see the New Popular Front coming. They said there's no chance Petro could ever win in Colombia. Look at the history of these fascistic forces, that are existing here in Colombia. It could never happen. Everyone said, I was in Brazil for the election. And up until the day before, even though Lula was leading in the polls, a lot of people say, I don't even know. I was in places that were strongholds for the Workers' Party. And they said, we think, Bolsonaro might win. We're worried. We're working hard, but we're worried. They were able to sneak up on him in a way because they were presenting policies that spoke at a deeper level than the milquetoast fake opposition that you get from the Democrats or people like Macron, who's gone so far to the right, he's almost the national rally, like a lot of the liberals in countries like India and Colombia, who don't really support workers, at the end of the day, and they've been trying to offer their opposition on all this, that, and the third. They've been totally wiped out by the far right. It was only when the workers and the farmers and the peasants and the social movements for Gaza and others entered the field and organized millions of people, which reorganized the political arena in all these different countries, allowed new political forces to emerge to challenge this center-left consensus that had completely capitulated and collapsed to the far right over the past 10 or 12 years. It was only then when you were able to actually win. So for us here in the United States, we need a stronger socialist movement because we have to move from capitalism to socialism. The only actual solution to the problems, from climate change to poverty to hunger to whatever you want to say, the affordable housing crisis, I could go on all day. The only solution to that actually is to have a 100% people first over profit first policy, and that's socialism. But even in the context of our immediate moment, when we can build broad united fronts where not everyone has to say they're a socialist, there's no way that those broad united fronts can exist or succeed if the agenda is set by the Joe Bidens and the Democratic parties of the world. It can only succeed when there is a clear and direct class contrast and class content that allows people to see that this is something totally different than what is actually being put forward, that allows totally new forces to emerge, that embeds itself in the social movements like the unions and the movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people and the movement for Black lives and the movement around climate change, and allows leaders from those organic grassroots movements that are from the people to also emerge as leaders of our political movements. It's only in that context in which a united front can change the politics of the country and move things in a different direction. And the fact that we have not been having that in the United States is why things have only moved to the right since, let's say, 1976.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. We see that the possibility, the prospect for a renewed, vigorous, fighting, militant left, where socialists and Marxists play a leading role in united front with others who may not ideologically think of themselves yet as socialists, but who are fighting for justice and fighting against oppression and exploitation and all of the manifestations of what's wrong with capitalism. We can see that this is urgently needed, everyone. This is urgently needed. Biden, not a solution. Democrats, not a solution to the far right, but the people are the solution. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, as always.